I'm happy to introduce you the submission of Tessa van der Heijden, reliably reacting to partners' action with the social intrinsic motivation of transfer empowerment. Tessa, please, the stage is yours. We don't hear you, you're muted. Okay, your audio should be okay now if you want to start. We still don't hear you. We still don't hear you. Maybe I suggest you, as we've done before, to log out and log in again, since that we're having these problems. I've activated your audio, so it should be working now, because now it's saying me to deactivate it. Tessa, try. I still don't hear you. Can anybody hear her? I think that maybe you should log out and relog in, or trying another exactly, even neither Hiroki, or you can try another audio inlet. Yeah. Thank you, Hiroki.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
That's great. Okay, perfect. Then I'll share my screen.
Yes, please go. We don't hear you anymore. I will ask you, are you able to activate your audio on your own? Otherwise, yeah, it should be active now. But we don't hear you. Or maybe if it's not too heavy, you can try to send me your presentation and I can show it in the meantime that you try to speak without making start the presentation. That maybe seems a problem at the beginning, at the moment. So I see again, Tessa, let's see if she will be able to connect with us now. Yes, Martin, I think it's what happened, but I have no explanation why it happened. I told her she could otherwise share with us her presentation and
Hello?
yeah, we hear you, Tessa, now.
Now you can hear me? Can you please nod?
Yeah, I can hear
Okay.
you.
So I don't have any feedback. It's a bit weird. Okay, but I will start right now. Now share my screen. I have to leave the meeting again. Okay.
Okay, we see your presentation and I still hear you for now.
Great. Okay.
But please try to fasten it up because you will have only 13 minutes now. Please.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
So our paper is reliable reacting to partners' actions with social intrinsic motivation of transfer empowerment. Many applications require artificial agents to cooperate with each other, for example, autonomous driving, package delivery systems, and home care robots. This image is from a research project that developed a robot to teach people dancing. I've chosen this image because the robot has to pay close attention to nonverbal cues that the human sense. Like many AI researchers, we are interested in designing a learning system that can cooperate with humans. For example, ad hoc teamwork in which a robot needs to join a group of agents, or designing a learning system that can pick up social conventions. We first need to discuss multi-agent reinforcement learning to understand the problem that we're gonna try to tackle. So multi-agent reinforcement learning can learn policies that can cooperate. However, the downside of many moral methods is that the agents can do well with their training partners, but not with partners unseen at training time, let alone humans. So our research question therefore is, how can these agents be trained with multi-agent reinforcement learning and remain reactive to their partners' behaviors? We have to know a bit of a background behind a DECPOM-DP. So DECPOM-DP is an MDP and it's decentralized, in which policies select actions based on their local observations. It's also partially observable, which means each policy obtains noisy and partial observation of the true state. For example, we have two policies, pi j and pi k, that select actions giving their local observations of the state. This results in a new state and reward. The goal of solving an MDP is to maximize future discounted reward and find a policy that can do that. In a cooperative setting, the reward is a single scalar that is shared among all policies. And so the problem with this is that of credit assignment. It is hard to know which agent contributed to the reward. One way to solve this is to use centralized critics, which obtain all the observations and actions of all the policies. But the unfortunate downside of this is that the resulting policies don't pay attention to their partners anymore. One work that tackles this is by rewarding influential actions, which was done by Jacques et al. They developed a reward for this. And the social influence is the KL divergence between a policy J that takes another agent's action K into account and if it doesn't. And this means that if an action leads to a relatively high change in the behavior of another agent's action, this action is considered influential and is rewarded. And in the paper, they show that this is equal to the mutual information between agents' actions. And they show that this reward, which is added to the original extrinsic reward, stimulates communication. However, it is unclear how to trade off optimal and influential actions. So these might be in conflict. This was a reason for the development of our method, which I will now present. We take a different approach. Instead of rewarding influential actions, we stimulate states in which agents can influence each other. This notion, which we call transfer empowerment, is based on empowerment. Empowerment is the channel capacity between next state and action. And similarly, transfer empowerment is the channel capacity between two actions at subsequent time steps. To explain this a bit more, let's consider two policies, J and K. We calculate how K's action could have influenced J's policy. This is done by using a hypothetical policy omega that is used to maximize the mutual information. And our hypothesis is that training agents with this channel capacity leads to policies that are reactive to their partner's behaviors. And in order to compute this efficiently, so the maximal mutual information between these two actions, we use a variational approximation, which is estimated by two function approximators, Q and omega. And now maximizing I hat. We can officially do this by running gradient ascent in theta. And note that J now comes from pi, the original policy, while the action of K is computed by an hypothetical policy, which only maximizes the mutual information and is not used to actually execute these actions in the real world. And we hope that this incentivizes states that allow for information to flow between agents. But also, since we are training policy J in this case, to make this policy more reactive towards the policy of another agent or another partner. So now I'm going to explain how we're going to test this. And we've developed a simple scenario where we have two agents, the green one which can move and the gray one which can send signals or symbols. And the speaker agent, the gray one, has privileged information about a target landmark, one of these three landmarks. And the moving agent does not know where the target is, and they need to cooperate in order to get reward, which is basically the relative distance of the moving agent with respect to the target. So the speaking agent has to send a symbol. The moving agent has to decode the symbol in order to have it being close to the target, then having a high reward or a small penalty. Now, this is not a very difficult scenario because the speaker basically has to have one symbol per target landmark. But we made it a bit more difficult by adding more landmarks. And now the speaker cannot indicate a single symbol per landmark. Rather, it needs to have a strategy or an encoding scheme that resembles movement. And we have an even more challenging situation in which the listening agent doesn't even know where either obstacles or landmarks are, and it has to completely rely and react to the symbols communicated by the speaker. We first are going to look at the learning curves for all 3 tasks. Social influence actually struggles, which you can see with the green line. We think that it is due to an inference between the added reward and the best exploitation strategy, which we explained a few slides earlier. Now, if we look at the challenging task, empowerment seems to perform similar to the baseline, while it clearly improves in the hard task. We can also look at the test performance, where we look at the average distance towards the target landmark, which is actually equal to the reward. But we can also look for the hard task at the number of obstacles hit. And here we can see a clear difference. The difference in hit obstacles, particularly small for transfer empowerment, indicating that transfer empowerment helps with the higher reactivity required to navigate around the unseen obstacles. Social influence seems to have a low value as well, but we observed it was due to moving quickly out of the field or not moving at all. So the higher the worse and the lower the less. So it's basically a percentage of how often the obstacles were hit. Now, why is this difference between the baseline and our empowerment? So we analyzed the action distribution of the moving agents. And so you can see the x-axis has all 3 movement directions. And then we, for the hard task, plotted how often they occurred. And we see that the baseline actually hardly stops. It doesn't stop, while we have a more uniform distribution, and it also stops. And so we speculate that it might be due to it might be difficult for the listener to learn when to use this action for the baseline, as it's detrimental in most cases. And the bias towards reactivity in transfer empowerment might help to keep this rare action as an option, following a symbol by the speaker that might become a stop signal. It could also be a state that allows high control in situations in which lowering the speed increases the agility. So basically waiting is actually...
You have still 2 minutes.
Okay, so actually there's only 1 slide left. And that's, we want to further analyze it. And then we could do this by giving the listener just a symbol. So we interfere with the speaking agent and we produce the symbol ourselves. And then we see that the baseline has a fairly good movement direction. So if it, for instance, gets this signal, the blue one, it would move down, and the orange one would move up. Well, social influence actually only moves left and right, which is pretty strange. But if we look at empowerment, we can see that it's almost they're orthogonal. So this is a very good situation, and you could also see that it clearly stops when it there's a signal that it infers as a stopping signal. Whereas here you have 2 overlapping. If it gets a blue, it also moves down, which is a bit strange. So we were very happy with this results. And yeah, we showed in this these experiments that when training with our empowerment value, that the listening agent reacted better to the speaking agent. And yeah, if there are any questions, I'd like to answer them.
Yes, I'm sorry, but I think that we are running late, that we cannot have your questions now. So if you have any questions for Tessa, please write them in private here on Zoom or on Slack. And now I'm sorry, but yeah, I'm sorry, but it's the moment to move on to the next presentation. That is the one of paper 61 that will be presented by Hirotake Abe. Hirotake, please share your screen. Okay. Yes.
Can you see my screens, and can you hear my voice?
Yes, perfect. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. The title is as shown here, and I'm Hirotake Abe, second author of this paper, and this paper was, this talk is supposed to be presented by Teoto Endo, the first author, but unfortunately he got infected by COVID-19 virus last week. So he was very willing to present this talk in ALife 2022, but unfortunately he cannot give a presentation. So instead of him, I'm going to present this presentation by borrowing his slide. And the theme of this presentation, the talk, is how to automatically generate the congestion control algorithm. What is congestion is shown here. It's not all about the car traffic, but congestion in communication network. On the internet or the other IP-based networks, data are transferred as a stream or packets. Packet is a fragment of data. And network equipment like routers have limited number of packet buffer. And if the number of incoming packets exceeds the number of packets that can be transmitted from the router, it may cause congestion, resulting in a consecutive drop of packets. It resulting in the lower performance of communication. This is the very basic strategy for controlling congestion. This is called AIMD. AIMD stands for additive increase and multiple decrease. This equations is a very simplified form of AIMD. In reality, the equations are more complex because the size of a packet may differ. This equation is assuming that every packet has a constant size. Then we can get these equations. When there's no congestion in the network, the TCP module increases the number of packets simultaneously sent from sender to receiver by adding +1. And if the congestion is detected, the TCP module reduces the number of packets sent simultaneously by dividing the number of packets by 2. This is very simple form. And the CWMD stands for congestion window, and this means that how many packets are sent in one period. And this is the output from our network simulator. And from this, that some congestion is occurring here because we can observe that the number of packets sent simultaneously become half. And also we can observe many congestions is happening here. So with using this mechanism, the TCP connection adapts to the congestive situation of real network. Why we need this kind of mechanism is that we cannot know how many other users are using the same network link simultaneously. So the TCP have a mechanism to automatically adapt to the realistic situation. And here's a brief history of TCP congestion control algorithm and also the technology and target application on top of the TCP algorithm. And New Reno is a very standard algorithm when it was used when the use of the internet is very popular. And another standard is Cubic. So I think most of you are now using Cubic, but if you are using Linux or if you're using Mac OS. And BBR is a candidate of next standard. It is developed by Google. On the other hand, this is a history of the algorithm, and also we have another history of the evolution of networking technology. When 1990s, most of users are using wired connection, and in 2000 we are going to move to wireless connection like Wi-Fi, and today many people are using the networking application on the cell phone network like 4G or 5G. And also the application is changing from the text-based communication into streaming service like this and Zoom application. And I think because I'm not a machine learning people, so I think the most of audiences are more familiar than me. But there's a two example of the successfully generated the algorithms by using machine learning. One is the continuous valued optimizers, and another is image recognition. So there are some examples of the attempt to generate a new algorithm. So inspired by these works, we are trying to generate the congestion control algorithm using several techniques. One is quality diversity, QD for short, for searching high quality and diverse solutions. Another one is POET, paired open-ended trailblazer. This is a very smart way to evolve the agent. It is combined with the environment. Here's our proposal. We're going to do a co-evolution of network simulation environment and the congestion control algorithm as an agent in combination of QD and POET. This is a summary of our approach. So I'm going to explain this figure later. And for using the POET, we need environment. So for that, we choose to use the network simulator as an environment. More specifically, we control the environment for network congestion control agent by crafting the scenario for network simulator. This is a visualizer of network simulation. And here we have 3 networking equipment, and also we have 2 computers. And I think that node 3 is sending some message to node 5, and also node 4 is sending some data to node 6. So what important here is both traffic from 3 to 5 and 4 to 6 competes on this route and this link. So then it occurs the congestive situation in the network. So if we make the number of the competing nodes, competing traffic increased, so we can make more difficult stages for agent. So by reducing the number of nodes, we can reduce. So then it means that we can control the difficulty of the problem. And for agent, we use the grammatical evolution. So if we use the original or original form of grammatical programming, it may produce some program code that may be syntactically incorrect, so that cannot be compiled and run. So we use grammatical evolution that it can ensure that we always get the program code that is syntactically correct. This is a snippet of the grammar that we defined for this experiment, for our experiment. For the complete form, please refer our paper. And in our setting, the agent, the congestion control agent have 4 states. One is open and others are disorder, recover, and loss. The open is a normal state, and disorder and recover and loss is it means there is a possibility of the congestion. The loss is a most serious state. And the disorder is means that there's the sign of congestion. And this is how we connect the network simulator and also the agent represented as the grammatical evolution. So the both the environment and agent are paired like this, and I put it in the poet runtime, and we conduct evolution by using the crossover or mutation, and we'll get many agent and at the pair of agent and environment. Do we select some of the pairs that have a higher adaptation score? But unfortunately, this takes very long time to run, because each time we evaluate the pair of agent and environment, we have to run the network simulator. It takes very long time to complete. For example, it takes several 10 seconds to several minutes for one agent, one pair. So if we do the entire process with this method, it takes very long time. So we have another idea to reduce the time for entire process. That is using QD to generate an initial set of agent. More specifically, we use the CMAME method to generate the initial set of agents. And this is the setup for the generation. And this is the heat map that we get by using the CMAME. And we use the first dimension of the heat map as the average congestion window size. And for the second for the second dimension, we use the standard deviation of a congestion window size. Here's a map of what we get with using CMAME. And this color, each color represents the adaptation score of each agent situated in the square. And we can see that around here, we could find the agent with highest score. And this is what we expected before we run the experiment. But other finding here is we also have another agent with highest score around here. So I think that this is very important for us to get a better initial agent. So if we manually create the initial set of agent, we only have the agent like this. But in reality, with using this method, we can get this initial agent. And these three are the agent with highest adaptation. So the comparing to the real congestion control algorithm shown here, so those three are not realistic, unfortunately, but then we can observe that there's some periodic change in the congestion window size. So I think this is a very good step for finding a good algorithm. And this is observation of the agent generated. And we can observe the similar behavior to the existing congestion control algorithm. So this is not completely the same, but this have the same, a similar behavior. So this is, I think, we feel that this is in a good direction. And the next experiment to evolve the agent and environment by using the initial set generated by QD. And I'm going to skip these details. And this is the result of agent, the best agent. So the y-axis means the fitness of the agent evolved in the pair the poet environment. So, and at the time we put the initial set of agent in poet, the score was like this. But after several iterations, we can get the agent with fitness like this. It means that the not only QD is enough for the best, a better agent, but using the poet technology, we can get better agent, even though it takes very long time to complete. So here's the summary of our talk, and by combining the QD and the poet, we could get some algorithm that looks like have the similar behavior of existing algorithm made by researchers or developer in real world. And also that we confirmed that not only using QD is not enough for better creating better agent, but the combining poet can improve the quality of agent generated in this environment. And so we can see some good sign of the good agent here, but we are not satisfying with these agents. So there's a lot of things that we should consider by, for example, by improving the grammar of agent or the adaptation to the environment. And also we can, we have to improve how to create the environment. If in current situation, if we slightly change the environment, it sometimes becomes very hard environment for agents. So we are now working on how to moderately control the environment. This concludes my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Hirotake. So do we have any question? Maximum one, probably, because we are running out of time. Please write it in the chat. Otherwise,
okay,
let's wait a second. Otherwise, I have one. But okay, maybe I can start with my one. So maybe so I mainly work on a wet ALife and using cells and using this kind of things. So, however, these kind of principles at the end could be so it would be have to really simplified system of, for example, of neural networks or type of cell-cell communication. But at the end, working on it, we could be able to predict the signaling, for example, between cells. Could it be used in a faraway future, this kind of computation to predict the cell's answer to the environment change?
Sorry, I couldn't get the question. So could you?
Yeah. So
repeat?
Do you think that in a future, this really it's from this kind of simple model that you're working on of a recipient and instead another person agent, like sending a signal, we could arrive in predicting the answer of cells or of, for example, like neurons to signal in the environment?
synchronizing environment.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
to-
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So could you write in the
Yeah,
Slack?
I can do it. Yeah. So,
Yeah,
however,
thank
in the meantime, we run out of time because it's already 2:40. Yeah, I'll write you in private, Hirotake. Thank you. I'm sorry for the strange
you.
question. So now it will be the moment of submission number 95. It would be Bente Riegler. I don't know how to exactly spell the surname. Okay, I see there is a presentation. I don't hear anything. Try to activate your audio. Otherwise, I will do it from the. Okay, I will ask from.
now,
okay,
is
yeah,
it working?
now I can do
Yep.
it. Yeah,
No.
please go. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm Bente Riegler, and my topic is the information complexity of navigating with momentum. First, I want to show you a video. I think I have to do a new share. This video looks like it's working, but sadly it isn't. So we gotta go to another window.
So we see only a stopped image for now, but now yes, we see it.
Now
Perfect.
it's working.
Yeah, perfect.
Exactly.
Thank you.
So we see a little mouse that is reaching somewhere. This mouse is actually controlled by optostimuli and is not my work, but my work has something very close to do with this. And if you stick to my talk, you will find out what. It is moving it with momentum. That's the first part. Now let's go back to the actual presentation. I have created, in navigation, we usually have a model that works on kinematics only, on positions like locations. When we talk about grid wheels and theoretical models, if we have more complicated models for robots or helicopters or driving cars, of course, we have dynamics in there. We have states that are modeled as positions. We have actions that are single steps in any direction. Can be north, east, south, west, can be more granular, but we have actions that stop after a single time step. In dynamic movement, of course, the velocity that stays there moves the agent still further. Now, for our cognitive cost measurements, we will use relevant information. Relevant information, you can ask me more in detail later, but I will not go into detail here. Know the first sentence, the relevant information is the minimal information an agent needs to make a good enough action. Good enough is here defined by a reward coming from reinforcement learning. So some arbitrary reward function. Can be minimal cost to go there, can be a threshold, anything. And we say good enough action because sometimes actions have a very similar outcome, even though they are different actions, but we don't care. It doesn't matter if I go the left way or the right way, if they're mainly similar. Now, that is what relevant information tries to do. Measure the information in mutual information for a good enough action. For our position model, this means we get policies like this and a measurement. So here we have a goal state at the side. Each time the agent moves one step over. In every state here, it uses the same action. Thus, we get a relevant information of 0 bits. No information about the state is necessary to decide what is a good action. In the goal in the middle, we have, of course, 2 sides, and the agent needs to distinguish the sides, meaning this whole area from position 0 to position 3 becomes one state effectively, because it is the same action. And on the other side as well. Now, this leads to irrelevant information of 1 bit, because we have to distinguish between 2 things. So this is previous work in a way. Now I want to upgrade it to actually model momentum, model velocities. For this, I created the VA model, or velocity acceleration model, in this paper. Here we have a state space that also has positions like before, but adds a velocity. So we do a simple Cartesian product of all the positions that are available and all the velocities the agent can reach, and have this our base state model. Actions are positive and negative accelerations. So the agent can change its velocity. So we have a function that says we have our current velocity, the action, whichever one it is, can also be 0, and then we have a new velocity. And it moves then by the world according to it. This is very general early control theory, but it does not have any forces in a way. There's no mass to it. It's simply states, velocities, and accelerations. The agent in this model cannot directly move, and I will show you in an example what this means. Given we have our agent here at position 6 and velocity 0, in the next state, nothing would happen to it if it does action 0. Now it does action +1, meaning it will move to the state position 6, velocity 1, but it will not change its position already. This only happens in the next state. It does +0 as its action, so nothing happens there, and moves 1 state over. Now, we have defined this agent cannot get a higher velocity than 1 in both directions, so the +1 action here does not affect the velocity further. It stays at velocity 1, but again changes the position. Now, when the agent wants to stop, it cannot do immediately so. So if it would want to reach this state, that's impossible. Instead, the agent does now the action to stop -1, and still moves a step. And of course, this would work in the other direction the same way. And now we have a stopped agent. It's a simple model. Now we come to defining a goal. Usually we define goals as trapping goal states, 1 position, multiple positions that the agent cannot leave once it has reached them. Or at least when we do information theory, we do that. And we have a position. But what do you do about the velocity? It can be 0, then the agent does not move automatically, but it could leave again. Or it could be everything. Well, let's see first at external stopping. Here you can see an aircraft carrier, the arresting gear of it, and I again will have to share another screen to show you the video, what it does. I hope you can see it. This is not the normal arresting gear. It is an emergency arresting gear, which is very clear what it does, how it works. It stops the airplane. Thus, the airplane actually only needs to reach a position and not the velocity of 0, unlike the airplanes that we usually fly with. They have to stop by themselves. Oh, it's working. Nice. So this means we have a position and include all velocities in the goal. Such we have a goal that is position of the goal and all velocities in a mathematical sense. This is rare in the world. As I say, it's an aircraft carrier. We built it this way. most of the time it doesn't work. The mouse had to kind of stop itself. Of course, it had the pole to stop the hand and the thing it was grabbing, but it had to control itself to not reach further. So we have this very rarely, which means most of the time the agent has to control the stopping itself. Thus, we create another type of goal where we have a position and the velocity 0, which looks like this. In this case, the goal in the middle would be there, and these do not count as goals. Now, let's look at what the results say if we now use the same goals as before, the one on the side and the one in the middle, with the new model and relevant information to minimize the information the policy needs. If we have this assisted stopping, nothing changes. In all states, we still see the same action. We have a relevant information of 0. The only change is that this velocity now is a different one, a different action. It's not a position base that stops all the time, but goes over there and is stopped at the end. So this means moving with momentum and without is very similar confirmation-wise and thus cognitive cost-wise when someone else does the stopping for you. Now, if we change this and go to the other goal, we suddenly see a few actions where the agent actually has to, before reaching the goal position, start to stop. And in this case, once the agent is here, it has to go move over, get velocity to something like 0, and then move over there and so on. So it's having to do some complicated corrections, which we see nicely in the relevant information that went up to 0.39. If we extended the position so we would have a longer world, those relevant information would go down because all these contribute nothing, like nothing to the relevant information, and the relevant information is an average across the states. So if we have 20 or 40 states that contribute nothing and are just like every other state, we get a lower relevant information, but for this example, that is 0.939. When the goal is in the middle, we do an interesting observation that the relevant information is still the same as in the normal one. However, the distribution of the action is different. Again, we have a huge area on both sides that looks very similar and doesn't contribute anything in particular. It matters that it's 2 areas, but extending it further here or there would not much change the outcome. But here, in the area where the agent stops, we have complicated decision lines where the agent needs to be careful to not get into a different state. It needs precise information about the state to choose its good action. If we allow more velocity, this extends even further. And suddenly we also need the action to not change the velocity at all, because otherwise the agent would overshoot the goal, end up somewhere here, and not reach it precisely, which I think every one of us has experienced when trying to grab something, not really paying attention or something like this. We see this again in the relevant information. We have a 1.06, which simply comes from these states, which are precise states to take the 0 action. If we extend this word further, we will also see at some point, I think at around 15 positions, that in the highest velocity, we see the 0 appearing simply to ease out the entropy of the actions. But beforehand, it does not appear because it's less information than that. Well, back to the mouse, as I promised. In the mouse experiment by Becker and Pearson, they have not only stimulated the mouse to reach, but also measured the neurons and their activity in the int A, which is an area of the cerebellum. What we see here clearly is we have an outwards velocity, a time from the reach. So this is before reaching somewhere. This is the point of reaching the object, and this is the time afterwards. And we see around the time of reaching the object, there is a point at deceleration, so stopping. And in this area, we see a high neural activity, both positive and negative. While in the rest of the area, far before or far after, you don't see this. This is very, very similar to these stoppings. The area of decelerating, of reaching the goal, is the area to pay attention when one moves with velocities and momentum. If one doesn't, it is not that clear. So, in conclusion, I created a velocity acceleration model in this paper. It is a semi-dynamic model, meaning it includes acceleration as part of forces, but it does not include mass. In my book, for agents, I think this is actually a positive thing, because agents that just move themselves are unlikely to experience a change in mass while moving or from one movement to the next movement. However, if we have talking about have robots that grab some things or change over time, the math is very important. But for agents that are usually working with their own body, I think this is really valuable to have. What we can see with this model, it's that stopping needs precise action and therefore cognitive cost, or as we measure it, information cost. Nicely is that this model can measure this difficulty, can show where this difficulty comes from and measure it with a value, so we see which setups are more difficult than others. For future work, I want to further explore what difficulties arise when changing the accelerations to include asymmetric stopping and starting. And usually humans or animals, we see that starting a movement takes longer than slowing it down. For example, when you see running and so on. So an asymmetry making stopping easier, allowing to stop two velocities at a time step while only starting with one. And of course, to apply this to an artificial agent and see how well it translates to this one. And with this, I hope I kept the time. And yeah, thank you for listening, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you. Yeah, we are running a little bit late, so we have time maximum for one question. Please type them in the chat in case you have them, or raise your hand. So from Seth Pollock, is there any value extending this analysis to continuous space and time?
Not yet. This is actually pretty difficult for information theory to do. Information theory works much better with discrete time steps, but we are working on exactly this in the group because it is important to have this continuous at some points.
Okay.
So
Thank you for your presentation. So it's now time to move on to the following one. So the following one will be the presentation of Hong Duang that it's already here so in before with presentation number 64. Please share your screen. The title of the contribution is the cost efficiency of institutional reward and punishment in cooperation dilemmas. Thank you. Yeah,
can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you, the organizer, for giving me this opportunity. So I will talk about our research on code efficiencies of institutional reward and punishment in cooperation dynamo. So this is a joint work with Thế and Han, which have been published in this journals recently. So we all know that Darwin natural selection is the theory of survival of fitness. So that is in populations that consist of different species, though with higher fitness will more likely to produce offspring and pass their genes into the next generation. So a direct implication of this theory is that individuals will have a tendency to be self-regard and competing with each other in order to obtain their highest possible fitness. However, we observe cooperation everywhere in reality, in biology, and in human society. And in fact, cooperation have been believed to be very essential for population to develop to new level of organizations. So thus a question of fundamental interest is how how cooperation emerges and how to promote cooperative behavior within self-regarding populations. There are many mechanisms to do so, but in this talk, we are focusing on one mechanism, that is code-effective interference. That is to promote cooperation using code-effective interference. So there is an external decision maker who interferes in population to achieve a desirable outcome. For instance, the UN interferes in some conflict regions in order to cease the fight and bringing the peace to that regions. Or as human, we often interfere in ecology system in order to maintain biodiversity. So the major advantage of this mechanism is that it enables large-scale cooperation. However, it is very expensive, it's costly because of we need to use human resources or equipment. So the question we want to answer is how to minimize the cost while ensuring a sufficient level of cooperation, or even how to obtain the maximum level of cooperation. This type of question have been studied extensively in the literature. So there is a large body of literature on evolution of cooperation on network, but they do not study external interference and how to do it in effective ways. There are some works on institutional incentive mechanism who study external decision making, but do not consider cost efficiency. On the other hand, there exists in the literature on decision making and mechanism design, there exists papers that study cost efficiency, but they do not consider population dynamic aspect, for instance, frequency dependent. More recently, there are papers that do study cost efficient incentive in finite population, but they only study from a numerical point of view. They do the numerical simulations. In this work, we will provide a rigorous analysis of this problem of cost efficiency of institutional incentive for finite population. So I will introduce the mathematical model and mathematical formulation for these problems. So here we consider a well-mixed finite population that consists of n self-regarding individuals. They interact with labors using corporational dynamics. Individual can be either a corporators, we call C, or a defector D. And they will update their strategies based on the so-called imitation dynamic. So here the probability that a player, an individual using strategy B imitated strategy A is given by this formula. This is the so-called Fermi rules in statistical physics. In this equation, Fa and Fb as the fitness of strategy A and strategy B, and beta is the strength of selection. And the policy for investment is that whenever there are K C player, that is our in our Markov chain in state K, then we will make an investment theta K. So X C player will receive an amount of theta K divided by K. So here we consider the K of rewards, and so we consider fixed individual investment in which every individual receives the same amount theta, which is theta K divided by K. This X operator payoff will increase by theta. So the mathematical problem that we study is to achieve at least a fraction omega of corporation with a minimum cost. So that from mathematical point of view, this is an optimization problem. So eta of theta here is the cost that you need to pay. And we want to achieve at least a minimum fraction of corporation. So that is expressed in this constraint. Theta need to be greater than theta naught, which is given by this. So in the formula, n, the letter n come from the fundamental matrix of the transition matrix that underlying this model. So similarly, we consider using instead of reward, we using policeman. So here we pay some cost to reduce the payoff of a defector. So we have very similar formula, except here z is n minus I. Z is the number of defector in the state I. So very similar formula, except z is I and z is n minus I. So we study this problem from a mathematical point of view. So first, what we do is to derive some quantitative property of the cost function. So in the first point, you see that this is some lower and upper bounds for the cost function in terms of the population size n. So this tells how the cost will grow in terms of the population size. Okay, we often study a system with finite but very large population, and one way to simplify it is to study the limit when the size of population tend to infinity. So this is the so-called infinite population limit. So from the above estimates, we can often the behavior of the cost when the population size tend to plus infinity. So it is given by this formula, and we see that ZE depend on the underlying game that we consider. So here we consider two different games, the donation games or public good games. So this is the infinite population limit. We also study the weak and strong selection limits. when we send the selection beta to 0, so this is the weak selection limit, and we send the selection to plus infinity, so this is a strong selection limit, and this is the results. And we see that in these limits, they are independent of the underlying games that we're considering. So this is the first theorem where we want to we want to study some quantitative properties of the cost function. We also study the optimization problem. So first we show that there exists a phase transition phenomena. So that is there exists a threshold beta star such that if beta is less than or equal to beta star, then the cost function is non-decreasing, and it is non-monotic when beta is bigger than the critical thresholds. So under the critical thresholds, we can easily solve the minimization problem because we know that it is a non-decreasing functions. So the harder part is when beta is bigger than the critical threshold beta star. Then we show that for sufficiently small population, then there exist 2 points, theta 1 and theta 2, such that when beta bigger than beta star, then eta of theta increasing when theta is less than theta 1, decreasing when theta is in between theta 1 and theta 2, and increasing again when theta bigger than theta 2. We need to do this because we want to solve the minimization problem. And in this case, we can also obtain the minimizer and minimizing problems. We also compare the cost when you do reward or punishment. So this we consider the difference between the cost when you use reward or punishment. You can see from here is that initially it is more efficient to reward, and then later on when there is a sufficient level of cooperation, it is better to punish. So this very similar to the policy first carrot and then stick in international relations. The key in our analysis is to understand the cost function. And in this formula, you see that it depends on the number n. You can see little n here. So they are the entry of the fundamental matrix that it comes from the modeling of the games. And the key here is that we consider 2 types of game, donation game and public good games. In this case, we can compute explicitly the fundamental matrix that allow us to do analytical analysis. So here I want to show you simulation to support our analytical reasons. So this is the weak and strong selection. You see, if you send beta to 0 or beta to plus infinity, we clearly see that the cost tend to some limit, and that is in accordance with the analytical result. And this is we show the phase transitions. So you see that when beta is small enough, then the cost function is increasing, right? And when you increase beta, then the behavior of the cost function start to change. And you see here, when beta is big enough, then the cost function first increase and then decrease and then increase again. So this is confirmed with the proof that we just showed you. So beta here in this model is a trend of selection, and it have very similar roles and temperatures in some physics model. And here we compare the cost when you do reward and placement. So to conclude, in this work, we consider a cost-effective interference mechanism for promotion of cooperation. We provide a rigorous analysis of this problem of how to obtain a certain level of cooperation with a minimum cost. We often some asymptotic limits when we send the population size to infinity, or we send the selection to 0 or to plus infinity, and often phase transitions. In the future, we want to generate our work to the scenario when the mutation is not small or more to more complex games where the payoff different depend on state, and we also want to take into account the structures of the population. With that, I would like to thank for the attention.
Thank you. We are again running a bit late, so please, if you have any question for Hong, please share them with him privately or otherwise on Slack. Yeah, so now the last talk is from Matthew Egbert, and the title of the talk is Towards Adaptive Sensomotor Autonomy Development, a system that can adapt to its own emergent and dynamic needs. So Matthew is at the moment traveling, so he asked me to share with you his pre-recorded video that he uploaded on YouTube. So I will now share my screen and start it. If you have any problem visualizing it or hearing the audio, please let me know.
Interesting thoughts. Yeah, I would, as Austin also says, it will be interesting to see the full work, but as you said, it may take some time since it's expensive. All right, thank you.
Okay, yeah, I heard it. So, yeah.
Francisco Varela. These philosophers were interested in this question.
I can even also, I know it's my headphones problem, but yeah, I can share it like this, and however, I can send on the chat the link.
I'm a senior lecturer at the School of Computer Science at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. These philosophers were interested in this question of what is life? And unlike a lot of researchers at the time, they didn't want to draw attention to the fact that life is an evolving system. They wanted to point out the fact that all living systems have a particular organization, an organization that they called an autopoietic organization, which means a self-making organization. In a nutshell, all living systems are constantly falling apart and yet capable of persisting because they're also constantly rebuilding themselves or maintaining themselves or repairing themselves in some way. Since the idea originally came about of autopoiesis, it's been generalized. And the more general term for autopoiesis is autonomy, at least in certain circles. Autonomy here refers to a kind of system that is a self-maintaining system that is constituted by a collection of components where all the components are constantly falling apart or they're inherently unstable, yet because of the way they all influence each other, they all enable each other to persist, they all repair each other, or in some other way prevent each other's degradation. And a biological cell has this organization, and this is what originally inspired Maturana and Varela, but also people are interested in thinking about this kind of organization in other contexts, not just in terms of biology and life, but other contexts, such as social systems, for instance. People are interested in how social systems might similarly involve lots of parts that are inherently unstable, but somehow stabilize each other. And one other context, which I'm particularly interested in, is the context of sensory motor behavior. And I'm not the only one interested in this. If you're interested to read more, there's this very good book called Sensory Motor Life, which is precisely taking this idea of autonomy and trying to look at how it relates to certain aspects of human and animal behavior, to try to understand how, similar to the way a cell has different parts, for instance, here a membrane and a metabolism, and these parts depend upon each other, as indicated by these arrows, there might be something similar going on in the behavior of people. In particular, the idea that our habitual behavior has a similar kind of form, where there's patterns of activity that we perform, and that these patterns of activity might somehow stabilize or reinforce the mechanisms that produce those same patterns of activity. So in both cases, you have this kind of A depends upon B, depends upon A kind of relationship. And it's just something I found interesting for many years now. And I've been interested in particular in trying to understand how it could operate in a sensory motor behavior context. And several years back, I think back in 2014, I developed something called the IDSM. This is a control architecture for a robot or a simulated agent that is intended to capture this idea of self-maintaining patterns of sensory motor behavior. Very briefly, it works by tracking trajectories that an agent takes through its own sensory motor space and trying to get the agent to reproduce those trajectories. So crash course in sensory motor space, imagine you have a robot that's moving back and forth in front of a light. You could plot the position that robot takes in time as moving for back and forth, right? Or you could plot it in sensory motor space, where you say this is the rate it's moving forward is on one axis, for instance, and the state of its one sensor is on the other axis. And instead of a time series, we have a phase space type diagram showing the states of all of its motors and all of its sensors. In this case, it's just one motor and one sensor for simplicity's sake, but generally these spaces are much higher dimensional. And again, the idea of the IDSM is that it tracks trajectories in this space, the sensory motor space, and tries to make them happen again. Very briefly summarized. So how does the IDSM work? Well, it tracks these trajectories in sensory motor space. When it's in an area of sensory motor space that it's not in before, the motor activity is random. As it goes through any trajectory in sensory motor space, it records where it's been in that space and how it's been changing through these nodes, which are schematized here as arrows. And then later on, when a trajectory re-encounters one of these nodes, it kind of gets pulled into the path that was being taken in sensory motor space before. Over time, these nodes degrade, so the system forgets what it did in the past, in a sense. But when these nodes are revisited, they're reinforced. And the whole point of this architecture, where I find it interesting, is when you get these kinds of cycles, these patterns of sensory motor behavior that are reinforcing the nodes that produce that pattern of sensory motor behavior, or at least constrain it heavily. And these are what we refer to in the IDSM as habits. These habits are a little bit analogous to paths that are traced in the grass when people walk through it. You imagine an empty field. People might take just a random path through it at the beginning, but once there's these paths that people have taken in the past, well, then they attract other people to take similar paths in the future and keep the grass from growing over them. So in a way that's similar between the IDSM and the fields, you have these paths that reinforce the mechanism that produces the path. The problem that I've had with the IDSM is that the habits that form are not particularly adaptive. They're sometimes robust to some perturbations. At ALife in 2018, I did an analysis of some of the kinds of perturbations that some of the habits are robust to, but I've been inspired or encouraged internally to develop a new architecture that produces habits that are more adaptive. What I want is for habits to be capable of changing their form or the way that they work so that if their environment changes, if some of the sensory motor contingencies of the robot change, or anything else changes in a sense that the habits themselves can adapt and change their own operations so as to persist over a wider variety of environments and conditions. And so this is a new architecture called DISA that I'm developing. And the way it works is it also has these nodes that are in sensory motor space. But now I'm trying to make it so that these nodes, in a sense, can perform a very basic form of learning, where each node learns to try to guide the sensory motor trajectory to other nodes that haven't been visited recently. And the way this works is that each node has two velocity vectors, two ways that it specifies how the sensory motor state should change. And these two nodes, or these two vectors rather, are given a chance to control alternately. So each step of the simulation, one vector is in charge, and the next step, the other is in charge, and they go back and forth, each having a chance to control the sensory motor or the motor state. And for each turn that they have, they're given a score in a sense of how well did they bring the system towards other nodes in the model. And it's a 1+1 evolutionary strategy. If you're familiar with it, you've got these two possible solutions. Whichever one's worse gets made to be a little bit more like the one that's better. And over time, they should both learn through some, plus there's a bit of random noise added. And so you get this very simple evolutionary strategy through which these nodes can learn to cause the motor trajectories to go from one to the next to the next. The scoring is just essentially, as I think I've just said, nodes that cause the sensory motor state to go to other nodes are given a higher score than ones that don't. So this node pushed the sensory motor state up like this. The motor vector is pointing up here, but not everything is directly controlled by the motor. The sensory state in this case might be decreased because of the increase in motor state. So this has the net effect of moving away from the other nodes. So the blue trajectory here gets a worse score than the purple trajectory. Again, the goal of this is to create a medium where self-reinforcing patterns of sensory motor emerge and they're capable of adapting to changes in the environment or sensory motor contingencies and so on. We're really in a really early stage of development with it. I'm looking at individual nodes, like here I've got a single node, node 1, which is in between two other nodes, node 0 and node 2. And I'm imagining that they're part of a larger collection. And I'm really trying to be confident that I understand the system that I'm working with, and I'm convincing myself that indeed this node can adapt from a variety of situations to do its part and take the system to the next node. And I don't have time to describe these plots, but there's some more details in the abstract. And of course, I'd love to chat with anybody who's interested in this model. In a nutshell here, though, the velocity vectors of this node are indicated by the green lines. They start off in a bad state where it's actually trying to make things go back to the earlier node, but the green trajectories become positive, which is in a sense causing it to move on to the next node. As I develop, I'm going to take what I learned from these kinds of basic experiments and improve upon the architecture and make sure that it's capable of doing what I want it to. And I'm going to be doing that, but looking at this level, the individual node, and then looking at this level, which I've also already started some work in, of looking at collections of nodes and looking at how adaptation at the individual node level can hopefully, if it's performed by all of the nodes, will turn into a kind of adaptation at the collective level. I know that was fast. I only had 10 minutes. I hope it fit in. I hope you're interested enough to get in touch and ask me if you have any questions. And I hope you enjoy the conference. So thanks very much for your time.
Hi there, everybody. If you can hear me, I am here for the Q&A. So hopefully my internet doesn't cut out during this phase. But if you have questions, I can answer them if we have time for that, Sylvia.
Yes. Yes, sorry, it was a bit slow answering my computer. Do we have any question? Please leave it in the chat if you have them. So why 2 vectors at each node and why not 3 or more?
Sorry, I did lose connect. Why 2 vectors at each node? Okay, why not 3 or more? So it's motivated by simplicity in a sense. So the way the algorithm works is, each one of these velocity vectors has an iteration to try to change the motor state, and then it swaps back and forth between the 2. two velocity vectors, or two attempts to make the sensory motor state go to other nodes. The more velocity vectors I have, the less regularly each one will have a chance to regulate the sensory motor state, right? To test out its influence and see if it's bringing it to the next node. So the idea is it's a kind of online learning, right? So as the sensory motor state is being changed, it's going back and forth very quickly between these two velocity vectors. And the more velocity vectors I'd have, the less regularly each one would have to have a turn at trying to control the motor state. And in theory, I think 2 is enough. The evolutionary 1+1 strategy, I think, should be enough for it to be able to learn in this case. Does that make sense? more chat questions here. Cool. Okay, thanks from Seth. Oh, I can't hear you, Sylvia, but I can read the question. Okay, I can't hear Sylvia. I see your lips moving, but I do see the question in the chat.
Okay.
And were you just reading the question in the chat?
No, we should move on with the program.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's what I said.
Okay.
Exchanging private the message with Jonathan. And yes, now the cherry part will be taken over by Pasquale Stano. Hi, Pasquale. Good evening.
Hi, Silvia. Good afternoon. So yes, it's a pleasure for me to chair this second part of the session. So I would invite the first speaker, that probably is Anja Bostinar, right?
Hi, I'm actually going to be presenting our paper.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Please share your screen. I will give you a sign when 2 minutes are missed.
Okay, I have a recording actually. I'll share my screen. Please let me know if you can't see or hear it.
Okay, please. Yes, we see your screen.
Okay, and let me know if you get audio.
Okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Claire Shregardis,
Perfect.
and today I'll be giving a presentation on our paper, Dirty Transmission Hypothesis. Increased mutations during horizontal transmission can select for increased levels of mutualism and endosymbionts. So a quick outline. First, I'll give a brief overview of endosymbiosis, then I'll introduce our hypothesis. I will give a short overview of the system we used, then I'll describe our results, and then I'll look at future questions. So first, a brief overview of endosymbiosis. So symbiosis is a close and long-term relationship between different species. This relationship can be either positive or negative or anywhere in between. And endosymbiosis describes a relationship between a host and a symbiont that lives inside it, called an endosymbiont. We look closely at mutualism, a symbiotic relationship in which different species cooperate for the benefit of all involved. And mutualism is widespread throughout the biological world. And like in all cooperative relationships, cheating can occur, which can lead to what we know as parasitism, in which one partner increases its own fitness to the detriment of the other. So we ask the question, why does mutualism evolve and stably persist? So there are a number of things that can select for mutualistic endosymbiosis, and this includes vertical transmission. Vertical transmission occurs when a host reproduces and the endosymbiont offspring infect the host offspring. So we can see in the figure, we have a host with an endosymbiont, the host reproduces, and the endosymbiont's offspring infects the host offspring. Another mode of transmission is called horizontal transmission, and this is when the offspring of an endosymbiont infects other unrelated hosts in the population. So as you can see in the figure, we have a host with an endosymbiont, and that endosymbiont's offspring went on to infect other hosts, unrelated hosts in the population. So it's possible that the chance of mutation during transmission could be different between horizontal and vertical transmission modes. For example, symbionts can accumulate more mutations during horizontal transmission because they have to leave their hosts and be exposed to the environment. And this leads us to our hypothesis, which is that if the mutation rate during horizontal transmission is higher, while the mutation rate during vertical transmission is lower, there will be selection for mutualism in order to avoid deleterious mutations. And throughout this presentation, I will be using a single acronym, which is HTMR, that will stand for horizontal transmission mutation rate, because that is a mouthful to say a bunch of times. So just it's one acronym, HTMR. So in order to explore our hypothesis, we used a system called symbiolation, and this is an evolutionary agent-based simulation consisting of a population of hosts, and each of these hosts can have one endosymbiont. And then each organism has a genome consisting of a single value, which is called the interaction value. The interaction value falls anywhere between -1 and +1 and dictates the amount of cooperation or antagonism that a host or endosymbiont will engage in. So values below 0 indicate antagonism, and this can include resource stealing and defense from the hosts. And then values above 0 indicate cooperation and can involve resource sharing, and this can give partners additional benefits. The endosymbionts also have an additional trait called the efficiency value, and this determines how many resources an endosymbiont can convert to a usable form. And this represents the way that endosymbionts can accumulate deleterious mutations. And the efficiency value starts at 1 and it can mutate to become lower. So the interaction values of hosts and endosymbionts, as well as the efficiency value of the endosymbionts, are subject to mutation during transmission. We set the vertical transmission mutation rate to 10% for all experiments. And then we ran experiments with the HTMR set to 10%, 50%, and 100% for a full range of vertical transmission rates from 10% to 100% at 10% intervals. And this leads us to our main results. So this figure shows us the mean endosymbiont interaction value on the y-axis, and this is at each vertical transmission rate when the HTMR was increased. So for example, if you look at the vertical transmission rate of 30%, we can see the mean interaction value at an HTMR of 10%, 50%, and 100%. So we found that at the lowest and highest vertical transmission rates, there was no significant difference in the amount of mutualism, which is measured by the interaction value between different HTMRs. However, at vertical transmission rates of 30, 40, 50, 60, and especially at 30 and 40, we found that there were significant increases in the amount of mutualism from the 10 to 50% HTMRs. There was no significant difference from 50 to 100%, so it appears that a further increase does not seem to impact the level of mutualism. But overall, these results show us that higher mutation rates during horizontal transmission can select for more mutualism. You may be wondering whether this increase in mutualism is just caused by the efficiency value dropping and mutational breakdown. So we also looked at the mean efficiency value at each vertical transmission rate when the HTMR was increased. And that's what this figure shows. So the efficiency value does appear to be impacted by different rates of mutation, but it never goes below 90%. And this shows us our results were not due to some mutational breakdown. We then wondered whether the increase in mutualism was due to increased mutations in parasitism mutualism trait, which is dictated by the interaction value, or due to increased mutations in the efficiency value. So we first looked at the interaction value and parasitism mutualism trait. So the figure on the left is a crop section from the very first figure I showed you of our main results, and this is for comparison. Once again, it shows the mean endosymbiont interaction value at each vertical transmission rate when the HTMR was increased. And here the HTMR was increased for both the interaction value and the efficiency value. If you look at the figure on the right, it shows a very similar thing, except the HTMR was only increased for the interaction value. The mutation rate for the efficiency value was held at 10%. And we can see that increasing mutations to the interaction value alone does show an increase in mutualism from 10 to 50%, though this increase is not as great as compared to when there are mutations to both the interaction and efficiency value. So this shows that the interaction value does contribute to an increase in mutualism, but it's not entirely responsible for it. And you might wonder what the population distribution actually looks like when HTMR is increased. So here we have this figure which shows the count of phenotypes when the HTMR is increased and the vertical transmission rate is 30%. Here we can see that higher HTMR allows more intermediate phenotypes, and there's stable coexistence of different phenotypes across replicates. And I'd like to note that this is a total count across replicates. So some replicates show stable coexistence and some were dominated by one of the phenotypes shown. We then looked at whether the increased mutualism was caused by increased mutations to the efficiency value rather than the interaction value. So once again, the figure on the left is the same as the first figure I showed you of our original results for comparison, and with the HTMR increased for both the interaction and efficiency values. And the figure to the right shows the mean endosymbiont interaction value at each vertical transmission rate when the HTMR was increased for only the efficiency value, while the mutation rate for the interaction value was held at 10%. So similarly to when we increase mutations for only the interaction value, we can see that increasing mutations to the efficiency value alone shows an increase in mutualism from 10 to 50%. Though once again, it's not as great as compared to when mutations to both values were increased. So this shows that the efficiency value also contributes to the increase in mutualism, though is not completely responsible for it. And it appears that mutations to both the interaction and efficiency values during horizontal transmission have somewhat of a cumulative effect on the amount of mutualism. So in conclusion, we found that higher rates of mutation during horizontal transmission do select for more mutualistic behavior in endosymbionts. And we found that the interaction value and the efficiency value both had an effect on the amount of mutualism. Future questions we could look at include whether these results hold with larger populations and other forms of symbiosis. We had it so that each host could only be infected with single endosymbiont. So how would multi-infection influence these dynamics? And also, how would these dynamics change if endosymbionts were facultative rather than obligate as in our simulation? Well, we're open to any suggestions of more things we should look at. You can try simulation out for yourself at simulation.org, and you can also access it with the QR code. I'm also looking for a PhD lab, so if there's any interest, my contact information is below, as well as the contact information of my co-authors. Thank you so much for listening today, and I'd like to open the floor up to questions.
Thank you very much, Claire, for this presentation, also because you are very good in time. So I ask whether there are questions from the audience. Is there any question for Claire? You can write in the chat or raise your hand. Otherwise, I have a question. I read your abstract, and you also highlight in the conclusion that moving from single infection to multiple infection, things can change. And do you have preliminary results or any hints about what is going to happen?
I don't believe we've tried anything with multi-infection as of now. I think Anya's also here if she has any thoughts on that.
Yes, hi. Yeah, so we the funny thing with multi-infection is that as soon as there's multi-infection, when you want to do multi-infection, you then have to figure out how the symbionts are going to interact with each other, how like the host is going to interact with them. So another talk later this week is looking at one way of implementing those multi-infection dynamics. But we haven't taken the step of then with multi-infection dynamics, then testing this out further. So yeah, figuring out how you actually want the symbionts to interact, if at all, within a host is kind of a big conceptual jump that we're still working on.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? I see that you use a platform to study these interactions, simulation. Is this freely available?
Yeah, you can go to simulation.com and you can check it out.
Okay, okay, thank you very much. There are no other questions, so I think we can move to the next speaker to save some minutes. And the talk is about hereditary stratigraphy. And who will be presenting this?
That's me. I don't know is my audio working okay?
Perfect. Okay,
Great.
please share your screen.
All right, are the slides showing up for everybody?
Yes, please.
Great. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew Moreno. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a graduate student at Michigan State University, and I'm really excited to share work that I've been doing with Dr. Emily Dolson and Dr. Charles Ofria, designing genome annotations for digital evolution systems to enable phylogenetic inference in parallel and distributed computing situations. So I hope I don't have to work particularly hard to convince everyone here of the importance and usefulness of phylogenetic analysis in digital evolution work, but it does merit kind of touching on some of the highlights. So studying the phylogenetic history of digital evolution systems is important kind of most obviously as a way to get an anecdotal account of evolutionary history in order to better understand instances of evolutionary innovation, and however, it can also be used in kind of more systematic ways to detect ecological dynamics by studying the phylogenetic relationships of extant organisms. This is really important, especially, for example, in open-ended evolution work. It can also be used to characterize selection pressure and to study spatial aspects of evolutionary innovation. And so most phylogenetic analysis work in digital evolution systems relies on a perfect tracking model. So in this model, all of the events that occur inside of a simulation are routed into a centralized data structure, here represented by a filing cabinet, and are organized as they occur to build up a perfect exact record of the lineages as they unfold inside of the simulation. So they're organized inside of a tree data structure. This works really well for single CPU digital evolution experiments. And so you can think of this kind of like maybe everybody at a small house party trying to share a filing cabinet where, this is a reasonable number of people to be using the same filing cabinet and no one's going to have to wait for too long and there's not going to be too much traffic. I think that's kind of how house parties work. I don't know, it's been a while. However, as you scale up to parallel and distributed systems, this becomes much more like a giant crowd of people all trying to use the same filing cabinet. So you can really start to imagine how this can potentially bog things down by having lots of traffic and contention for this single centralized data structure, this filing cabinet. And when you introduce the possibility of data becoming lost or misorganized, then suddenly this scaling up perfect phylogenetic tracking to parallel and distributed systems becomes a much more challenging task and potentially much more inefficient. And so these issues motivated us to explore an alternate approach. Instead of perfectly tracking phylogenetic histories as they occur, what if we try to reconstruct them instead? So this might be how you're more used to thinking about phylogenetic analysis in kind of wet lab biology systems, where you have a set of extant organisms at the end of an experiment. They all have genomes. You grab bits of their genomes and do comparisons and then infer a likely phylogenetic history that gave rise to your set of organisms. So it's important to highlight that this isn't now an estimation instead of a perfect tracking of the ground truth. And so because in digital evolution systems, we have total control over how genomes work and how they're inherited, that kind of raises the core question of this work, which is how should we actually design these digital genomes in order to maximize the phylogenetic reconstructability of the system. And so to kind of illustrate the question at play here, we'll start off by walking through kind of a naive approach that you might come up with to solve this problem on kind of a first pass. So you could really easily imagine defining your genome system to be just a fixed length bit string, a series of ones and zeros. And as generations elapse, you apply mutation with, maybe a fixed probability. And we'll run forward a few generations here, doing some mutations as these genetic components are inherited. We'll grab our set of extant organisms at the end of this small evolutionary run and line them up and compare them. And by counting up the number of genome sites that match and mismatch, we can come up with an estimate of the number of generations that have elapsed since the most recent common ancestor between these two organisms at generation 5. However, kind of as you can imagine, there's some challenges associated with this naive approach, largely revolving around the issue of mutational rate. The possibility of back mutations and mutational saturation can make it difficult to have high resolution readings if that mutation rate isn't set correctly. And then there's also an issue with a possibility with being able to distinguish uneven branch lengths inside of this kind of system. And so these issues led us to be interested in exploring a more, to see if we could come up with kind of a more clever approach that takes advantage of the full control that we have in digital evolution systems. And so I'll kind of walk you through the approach that we came up with by example here. So this approach revolves around, the approach that we came up with revolves around blocks of randomly generated data. We call them fingerprints. This could be something like just, a little 64-bit packet of data. And the core idea is that as generations elapse, individuals inherit their parents' fingerprints and then generate and append a new fingerprint onto the end of the genome. So the genome is going to grow over time. So we can run this forward a few generations, and then we can grab our extant organisms. And when we line them up and compare them, the key intuition here is that if we line them up and read them from most ancient to most recent, there'll be a set of fingerprints that are identical, which represent the shared evolutionary history of these two organisms. And then where they diverge, there'll start to be different randomly generated packets of data. And so that gives us a really direct pointer to the generation of the most recent common ancestor between these two extant organisms. So due to the kind of layering here, in analogy to geological stratigraphy, we call this genome component a hereditary stratigraph. And a key point I just want to highlight before we move on is that this hereditary stratigraph doesn't need to have any phenotypic effect in simulations, and that it can be used as a neutral annotation on pretty much any digital genome. So hopefully this gives this approach kind of wide applicability across a variety of systems. If you've been following closely, however, you might have anticipated a potential issue with this approach, which is the fact that the genome is growing over time. So even if we're just adding little 64-bit fingerprints, after 1 million generations, we'll have 8 megabytes of data associated with each genome in a system. And if we have a population of 1,000, we'll have 8 gigabytes of extra data running around our simulation. And so clearly, in order for this to work effectively over long numbers of generations, we need to be able to do something more efficient here. And so the remedy is being willing to throw out and discard some of the fingerprints in order to save space. So here I've pruned this column so that we only retain every third fingerprint. And so what we're doing here is we're making a really direct trade-off between space that our annotations are occupying and the uncertainty that we're willing to accept when we actually do comparisons between the genomes to estimate the MRCA of two organisms, right? So if there's fingerprints missing, suddenly we have these windows where we know that the MRCA occurred somewhere inside of the window because one side matches and one side mismatches, but we can't pinpoint exactly where. And so this pruning process is the really subtle and interesting part of this approach, which in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of not go into the full detail of, but I do have some kind of pocket slides talking a little bit more about this. I'd be happy to go into in the Q&A if people are interested, but I will share some of kind of the high level issues here just to give some intuition. So one variable that we can manipulate inside of our pruning is the intensity that we prune with. So if we do no pruning at all, you can imagine very easily that the number of fingerprints we retain on the y-axis is exactly equal to the number of generations that elapse. If we prune at a fixed rate, like I just showed, we can reduce the number of fingerprints we're retaining by a fixed proportion, but we'll still be growing linearly in size. We could define a fixed size cap and grow up to that size and then cap the number of fingerprints we're willing to retain, or we could do something in between and potentially be willing to have logarithmic growth of our genome size with respect to the number of generations elapsed. Now, the second variable that we can manipulate in kind of deciding how to do this pruning is a little bit more subtle. It's the actual distribution of where we prune in the genome. So this is motivated by the idea that we might be willing to, there's good reason actually to think that we would be willing to accept greater absolute uncertainty in estimating the generation of more ancient phylogenetic events compared to more recent phylogenetic events. So what we can do is prune more heavily further back in the genome to throw away more fingerprints for more ancient time, and that be able to therefore retain more fingerprints for more recent time and be able to have greater uncertainty for more ancient events in exchange for having less absolute uncertainty for more recent events. And we call this recency proportional pruning. So that's kind of the lay of the land with respect to the intuition for the approach that we've been developing. And getting into the results now, one thing that I wanted to highlight is the space efficiency of this approach, where this approach, for example, can allow us to estimate the generation of the MRCA between any two organisms with 10% relative error, up to 1 trillion generations using annotations that are smaller than a kilobyte per genome. So hopefully, what I'm trying to get at here is that this system is lightweight enough to be reasonably attached to genomes as an annotation in many different contexts without causing unnecessary overhead. And so hopefully it is widely applicable across a variety of systems. However, in order to actually test the effectiveness of this approach in facilitating actual phylogenetic reconstruction, we did some experiments where we took ground truth lineages from existing NK bit string experiments that were performed under different ecological conditions. And these lineages were for populations of about 100 individuals that were run for 5,000 generations. We took these existing lineages and we simulated the inheritance of these annotations, the hereditary stratigraph annotations down these lineages. And then we took the set of extant organisms at the end and performed up GMA reconstruction to try to estimate the ground truth lineage from that set of data that we have at the end from these annotations. And we used UpGMA reconstruction to perform these estimates. This is an approach from traditional phylogenetics that we're borrowing to take these pairwise distances between extant organisms and actually estimate a tree. And we were able to recover up to 85% of the information in our reconstructions using only 64 bits of annotation per genome. And we did find that the recency proportional retention that I mentioned a few slides ago did tend to yield higher quality reconstructions than that even retention. And Dr. Dolson has put together a really amazing interactive web visualization I encourage you to check out. That allows you to compare the reference and reconstruction genomes across a wide variety of parameterizations of the system. To wrap up here, the main takeaway that I want you to leave with is kind of just being aware of the availability of this genome annotation technique that's hopefully applicable across a wide variety of digital evolution systems. And so if you start to take your system or your system is already distributed in parallel computing, hopefully this can be a useful tool for you. We're making it freely available as plug-and-play software packages that can be incorporated into existing systems. It's available as a Python library on the Python packaging index, and hopefully it will be available as a C++ header-only library soon. And the other interesting aspect I just wanted to highlight was how digital evolution systems are starting to make trade-offs that mirror those in wet lab systems, which is really interesting. Lots of future work, one of the highlights being extending from asexual populations, which everything I've been talking about assumes, to sexual populations. With that, I'll credit the images that I used, my citations, acknowledge my co-authors, and the funding. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthew, for this nice presentation. Also, you are great because you stay in time perfectly. And therefore, now we have quite a lot of time for discussion, questions, or also for you if you want to add something. But first, let's see whether there are questions in the chat. Write in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, some minute to think. Okay, I can start with a question, always based on your abstract. You didn't have time to explain now in the presentation. What about the previous approaches? I mean, in which way your approach is novel and solve the problem of previous approaches? That sure there are.
Yeah, so to our knowledge, we're not aware of any digital evolution systems that have been explicitly defined or designed to facilitate phylogenetic reconstruction. And most of the existing work with phylogenetics and digital evolution does use perfect tracking. And so that's really where the I think the contribution of this work is pointing out that the possibility of moving away from a perfect tracking model, which potentially has issues scaling up to parallel and distributed computing, and then actually coming up with an algorithm that can enable phylogenetic inference without having to tune that mutation rate like you might think of in a that simple bit string model that I illustrated as kind of a contrast, and to be able to perform these inferences efficiently without having to use too much data to actually store any additional genome component to perform high quality reconstructions. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. There are other two questions in the chat. The first is from Russell Standish, is the following. Is the issue more with the reconstruction of phylogenetic tree rather than archiving birth death events?
So I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Russell, that you're referring to kind of the issue with scaling up a perfect tracking approach. And I think what you're getting at is the fact that it would be relatively easy to save data from in each individual component as the simulation runs, each individual CPU, and then at the end, grab everything and bring it all together. And so I think there is an issue potentially with archiving the birth and death events for very large scale simulations. You have to deal with the potential unreliability of different computing components and the potential of parts of your simulation to fail. At certain scales, this becomes pretty much an inevitability. And if you are missing data under the perfect tracking approach, suddenly you could have these disjoint parts of your perfectly tracked tree that you're no longer sure how they relate to each other because you're missing parts of the data where they would actually have that relationship. And so the issue isn't just necessarily bringing together all of the data that would be necessary to do a perfect reconstruction, but actually reliably archiving it can also be an issue at certain scales.
Yeah, I suppose to reliably archive it, you have to determine when a particular reproduction happens that you've got a new organism. And that's quite expensive to do that. So yeah, I know, like for example, in the Tierra system, it tends to, they tend to only give a new species name whenever it's managed to reproduce a couple of times. It's actually persisted in the population, and so that kind of makes the intermediate forms a bit unknown. That's what you're referring to.
Yeah, that could definitely be a concern if you were trying to build up your phylogeny so that entries in the phylogeny only had distinct phenotypes as opposed to just kind of building up the phylogeny on the basis of individuals, even if those, you have repeat phenotypes represented by different individuals as they unfold in the phylogeny.
Okay, perfect. So I believe it's better to move to the next speaker, but Matthew, there is a question from Pen Rainford. You can read it in the chat. Maybe you can reply privately or publicly, no problem.
Great, thank you. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone.
Perfect. Okay, good. Next talk is about finding chemical organization in matter conserving artificial chemistries by Jonathan Young and Simon Colton. And probably Jonathan is going to present. Please share your screen.
Yep, sure. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, cool. Okay. So I'm here to talk to everyone about how to find chemical organizations in matter conserving artificial chemistries. Okay, so I'll first provide a bit of historical context. So yeah, theories on evolution are usually based on the dynamics of pre-existing entities, and therefore, you know, they can't often explain the generation of these entities in the first place. So
yeah, Jonathan, we have some problem to hear you perfectly. Seems a network issue.
Evolution cannot explain the origin. Hang on one.
Yeah, Jonathan, yeah, we cannot hear you very well, actually.
I'm going to try my phone in.
Yeah, or remove the webcam.
Okay, can you hear me any better now?
Now it's better. Please go.
Now it's better. Okay, excellent. Okay, glad to hear it. Okay. Lost. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so I'll start that again. Okay, so I'll first provide some historical context. So theories of evolution are usually based on the dynamics of pre-existing entities, and therefore cannot explain the generation of these entities in the first place. Darwinian evolution cannot explain the origins of life or
Yeah, I'm sorry, there are still problems.
Transition from multicellularity. No, okay. Okay. I'll just try something.
Okay.
Going to change my internet.
Okay, it can happen that the network is not optimal.
Can you hear me now? How does it sound?
Should be a little bit better.
Okay, let's try again. Sorry about this. Just had new internet installed today, so I'm not sure what's happening. Okay. Okay. Can you hear me as I'm talking now? Does everything sound okay?
The sound is a little bit better than before, but please go on.
Okay. Okay. So where was I? So yes, chemistry in comparison to theories of traditional theories of evolution. Chemistry is a constructive dynamical system in which molecules can combine or decompose into completely new entities. Fontana and Buss scientists regard biological organizations as sets of molecules that can collectively regenerate themselves via reactions. So in other words, a biological organization is considered a self-maintaining chemical system, according to Fontana and Buss. They identified that the lambda calculus fulfilled the requirements for such a chemical system. So they used a lambda calculus-based artificial chemistry to demonstrate the emergence of said organizations that could also combine into larger ones. A more general theory was developed by Dietrich and Speroni di Finizio that integrates stoichiometry, a prerequisite for the broad applicability of the theory. And they also provided forms of analysis that map a reaction network or the state of reaction vessel to a set of organizations. So, what defines an organization according to this theory? Well, an organization is a set of molecular species within a reaction network that is both closed and self-maintaining. A set of species is closed if all reactions originating from the set only produce species that are also within the set. And a set of species is self-maintaining if there are no reactions originating from the set that can cause any species to eventually deplete. For clarification, a reaction, quote unquote, originates from a set of species if its reactants are within this set. So, what are matter-conserving reaction networks and why do we care about them? Well, a mass-consistent reaction network is one in which the total change in mass for any reaction is exactly zero. And natural chemistry certainly conserves matter in this way, but not all artificial chemistries do. In fact, it has been shown that adding conservation of matter to an artificial chemistry can increase evolutionary activity or alter behavior in other interesting ways. Okay, so let's see an example of a matter-conserving reaction network. You can see on the right an example of a stoichiometric matrix for a reaction network, where the rows represent species and the columns represent reactions. We can read reaction 1 as consuming an instance of species 1 and producing an instance of species 3 and 4. Now, let's adjust the matrix with the set of masses for each molecule. So this set of masses can be seen on the left there. Now, reaction 4 reads as consuming and producing 5 units of mass, even though it consumes 3 molecules and only produces 2 molecules. We can sum each column to get the change in mass for each reaction, which is always 0, remember, in a matter-conserving reaction network. And summing each row gives you the change in mass for a species across all reactions. Note that the total reaction mass change always equals the total species mass change, which also equals 0, right? So yeah, just to clarify, if we sum up the change in mass for all reactions, this will equal the sum of changes in mass for all species. So this will become important later. Okay, so it turns out that an organization within a matter-conserving reaction network cannot contain an edge that is not part of a cycle. After going over the proof of this theorem, I'll demonstrate how the theorem is used to more efficiently find the complete set of organizations in a reaction network. The approach basically attempts to ignore some candidate organizations that we already know contain edges that are not part of a cycle. Okay, so in order to show this, I must convert the reaction network into a bipartite graph containing a node per reaction and a node per species. A reaction node's incoming edge originates from a species that is consumed by the reaction, and a reaction node's outgoing edge terminates at a species that is produced by the reaction. Next, let's partition the graph based on an edge that is not part of a cycle. So yeah, you may have noticed in the example network on the right, there is such an edge shown in the red dashed arrow. The partition consists of 2 sets of nodes. The set of nodes reachable from the end of the edge will be referred to as the sink, and the set of all remaining nodes in the network will be referred to as the source. In the example on the left, on the right, nodes in the sink are surrounded by a red dash border and nodes in the source are surrounded by a black border. Now, let's see how this partitioning can help to explain the flow of matter in the network by revisiting this mass-adjusted stoichiometric matrix. Notice that this partitioning means that matter from the sink is never used to produce source matter, and matter from the source is only used to produce sink or source matter. This is evident in our example on the right. We can see that reactions 1 to 3 consume and produce source species. Reaction 4 produces source and sink species, but reactions 5 and 6 consume and produce sink species exclusively. This means there is always a net loss of source matter. In other words, for source species, the total change in mass across all species or all reactions is always negative. If the total change in mass across species is negative, then at least one species must be depleting. This is true for all possible positive reaction rate vectors. Okay, so if we look on the right, a row of reaction rates, or also known as a flux vector, has been added in red at the top there. You can see that some species are still depleting overall, despite doubling the rate of reaction 4. Basically, this is just to demonstrate that changing the reaction rate doesn't change the previous insight that there's a net loss of matter for source species. Now, the definition of an organization does not consider mass at all, right? It doesn't care about mass. So let's remove the mass adjustment and go back to the regular old stoichiometric matrix. The change in mass for a species is now a concentration change. Removing the mass adjustment cannot cause a negative row sum to become non-negative. Or, in other words, changing back to a regular stoichiometric matrix can't transform a negative change of mass for a species into a non-negative concentration change. Basically, what this means is that for all possible positive flux vectors, at least one species will have a negative concentration change. A negative concentration change violates the definition of self-maintenance because the species in question will eventually deplete. We've already seen that an edge that is not part of a cycle induces a negative concentration change. Hence, an organization cannot contain an edge that is not part of a cycle if we're dealing with a matter-conserving reaction network. The example network on the right is not an organization, right? Because it contains one of these edges. Okay, so the theorem was used to alter the constructive algorithm for finding all connected organizations within a reaction network. The general approach of this algorithm is to find the complete set of connected semi-organizations and then determine which ones are organizations. I'll just explain what a connected semi-organization is. Okay, so two species are considered to be connected if there is a path from one to the other via reactions. The direction of the edges that make up the path doesn't matter, right? In the reaction network on the left, you can see that there is a path between all pairs of species. So the entire set of species is considered to be connected. So it's all one weakly connected component, basically. On the right, not all pairs have a path between them. So the entire set of species is not considered to be connected. I'm just going to introduce some slightly more concise language because the next few slides get a bit tricky. So from now on, when I describe a species as being consumed or produced within some set, what I basically mean is the species is consumed or produced in at least one reaction originating from the set. So you can see in the example network on the right, you can see that species 1 has a negative stoichiometric coefficient in at least one reaction. And so therefore, I just for ease of explanation, I describe it has been consumed in the entire set of species. Okay, so a closed set of species is a semi-organization if all species consumed in the set are also produced in the set. A species that is only consumed will eventually deplete, so all organizations are semi-organizations. But in a matter-conserving network, an organization cannot have a species which is only produced in the organization. Well, this is because the presence of such species would result in the organization containing an edge which is not part of a cycle. In the example reaction network on the right, species 5 is only produced, so the edges terminating at the species node are not part of a cycle. And I've highlighted these edges in red, you can see there. Okay, so we need to redefine semi-organization in matter in the context of matter-conserving reaction networks. Here, we define the closed set of species as a semi-organization if all species consumed in the set are also produced in the set, and all species produced in the set are also consumed in the set. The original constructive algorithm first removes the smallest connected semi-organization from a list, finds all connected semi-organizations directly above it, and adds them to the list. We repeat these first two steps until there are no more semi-organizations to be found. For each semi-organization found, we see if there exists a flux vector satisfying the self-maintenance condition. If the self-maintenance condition is met, the semi-organization is added to the list of organizations. Note that semi-organization A is considered to be directly above semi-organization B if A contains B, but A contains no other semi-organization that contains B. It's a bit of a mouthful. Basically, in the example on the right, you can see that above B, there is semi-organization C. So semi-organization A cannot be considered directly above B. Okay, so to get the semi-organizations directly above a semi-organization A, we iterate over each reaction containing species intersecting with A. And then for each intersecting reaction, we add the reaction species to A, and then we recursively add species produced in A until there are no more species to add. That's called computing the closure. At this point, there could be a species within A that is not produced in A, right? So for each combination of reactions that are able to collectively produce all of these unproduced species, we add these producing reaction species to A and repeat and basically go back to step 2. So in a matter-conserving reaction network, instead of just checking for species that are not produced, we also check for species that are not consumed. So instead, for each combination of reactions that are able to collectively produce all unproduced species and consume all unconsumed species, we add these producing and consuming reaction species to A and repeat and go back to step 2. So that's, again, a bit of a mouthful, but basically, this revised algorithm for matter-conserving reaction networks basically ignores semi-organization candidates containing species that are only produced. So by ignoring these candidates, we're effectively speeding up the algorithm. Okay, so a quick experiment was run to demonstrate the difference in execution time between the original algorithm and the altered one. To do this, 100 instances of the spiky RBN artificial chemistry were randomly generated, each with 12 atomic particle species. The aspatial matter-conserving reaction vessel is initialized with 12 instances of each species. 10,000 reactions were attempted to generate a reaction network for each chemistry. And then the original and altered algorithm were then timed for how long it takes to return the complete set of organizations. Okay, so you can see the result of the experiment on the right. Each data point represents a reaction network. The y-axis is the time taken for the original algorithm, and the x-axis is the time taken for the altered algorithm. The shade of the data point represents the number of organizations found for that reaction network. Note that everything is in logarithmic scale for readability. On average, the altered algorithm was about 9 times faster than the original one, and the mean number of organizations found was 143. For each reaction network, both algorithms found the same set of organizations, right? That's just to show that it was working correctly. The number of organizations found tends to increase with time, suggesting that more difficult to process reaction networks yield many more organizations. The disparity in time between the algorithms also increases with the number of organizations, suggesting that the benefit of using the altered algorithm may increase with the complexity of the network. In conclusion, the conservation of matter produces interesting behaviors in artificial chemistries, and the theorem and algorithm presented here could help facilitate research into how these behaviors impact the evolution of organizations. In fact, I've actually been using this algorithm to compare variants of a spiky RBN in matter-conserving reaction vessels. One avenue for future work is to find even faster algorithms that probably exist based on the theorem. You know, the optimization I presented here was a bit basic. Although bear in mind, I didn't take the approach of kind of like checking every edge within a semi-organization to see if it's within a cycle, since this is like really computationally costly. So finally, I'd like to thank the anonymous reviewers for helpful comments that really improved the paper. Thanks to my co-author / supervisor, Simon. And thanks for the EPSRC funded Centre for Doctoral Training in Media Arts Technology at Queen Mary, where I studied my PhD. Thanks for listening.
And thank you, Jonathan, for recovering after the initial delay. You were perfectly respecting the time, so there is time for one question.
Excellent.
Okay, there is one question in the chat from Chris Gordon-Smith. Does the model include anything like the rate constant in real chemistry or in a reaction specified by its reactant and products only? Or is a reaction specified only by its reactants and products? In other words, he's asking whether there are rate constants.
So I'm assuming he means the spiky RBN chemistry. So there's no, there's no rate constants. There's no explicit rate constants. Basically, it's a aspatial matter-conserving reaction vessel that the chemistry executes in. And so basically, what happens is two molecules are, well, called composite particles in the case of spiky RBN. Two are picked randomly, and then an attempt to form a bond is made, and then the product of that attempt is then simply returned to the reaction vessel. So that's how the artificial chemistry executes. So that, there's no explicit sort of rate constants.
Okay.
So I was wondering, so how the speed of the reaction is determined?
The speed of the reaction. So I suppose there's no concept of speed in that particular artificial chemistry. Because it's just choosing kind of pairs of composite particles at every time frame, as it were. So I suppose there's kind of an implicit speed. So if you were to pick two composite particles over and over again, some are more likely to be able to form a bond than others because there's multiple bonding sites. So it's not kind of explicit. There's no explicit concept of the speed of reaction. But
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Jonathan, again. And so we can move to the last talk of this session before moving all together at 5 to the plenary. So speaker is Michael Wong.
Hello,
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay.
Great.
You can share your screen.
All right.
But
Everybody seeing that?
Yes, it's a little bit shorter, 15 minutes. Please go ahead.
Sure. Wonderful. Well, it's just a great pleasure to be here. It's my second ALife conference. I've always enjoyed these. And it's wonderful to hear all of these amazing, fantastic flowing ideas over Zoom. So yeah, my name is Mike Wong. I'm a postdoc at the Carnegie Institution for Sciences Earth and Planets Laboratory, and I'm excited to share with you today a paper that I wrote with my good friend and colleague Stuart Bartlett at Caltech. Stuart is giving the ALife keynote speech on Friday morning, so I highly encourage you to also check that one out because Stuart is one of the most open-minded and polydisciplinary scientists that I've ever encountered. So this paper that we wrote together was published earlier this year in the Journal of the Royal Society Interface, and it's titled Asymptotic Burnout and Homeostatic Awakening, a New Solution to the Fermi Paradox. And don't worry if you've never heard of these terms before, because we literally made them up for this paper, and I'll explain them to you in just a sec. But to begin, let's start with something that you've probably heard of, the Fermi paradox, which can be stated as such. In a universe that seems amenable to abiogenesis and the evolution of life, why haven't we seen definitive evidence of extraterrestrial civilizations? And this can often be framed too in the language of the Kardashev scale. Why don't we see type 3 civilizations in the Milky Way galaxy? So I think that there are two major things missing from this kind of initial framework. Number one, we now know that evolution is not just a gradual process, but it's actually punctuated by major transitions in information processing, energy harnessing, and units of selection. And number two, that crises or singularities may occur at the scale of cities and planets that necessitate other major transitions to occur. And I'll explain what singularities mean in just a sec. But in other words, Stuart and I would contend that the Fermi paradox appears as a paradox because there is an implicit assumption that the trajectory of progress can be extrapolated from the past, but this may not be so. Okay, so what do I mean by singularities? Well, it turns out that cities can be thought of as sociological organisms, where socioeconomic quantities such as patents and GDP, R&D, total energy usage, but also things like illness and crime scale superlinearly with city populations. So on these graphs that you see on the left, we've got on the x-axis log of population, on the y-axis some socioeconomic quantity. And you see that these have a power law and they have a slope that is greater than 1. So beta in the top graph is 1.12, and the bottom it's 1.15. And for many of these socioeconomic quantities, this slope is somewhere between like 1.1 and 1.2. So the superlinear scaling has been attributed to the fact that social networks are driven by information flow in addition to energy and material networks. And so there's an analogy that can be made between cities and stars. So stars are nuclear reactors, and we know from astrophysics that the larger the star, the faster the nuclear reactions in its core, and the shorter the overall lifetime of the star. Cities, on the other hand, are social reactors, where the larger the city, the more social interactions per capita per time occur. In fact, people even walk faster in larger cities. So the pace of life in larger cities is greater. And so in a classic paper, Betancourt et al. Showed that this superlinear growth to cities results in singularities or crises, where you approach infinite n in a finite amount of time. And n could be any of those socioeconomic quantities that are scaling with a beta greater than 1. So you can push these crises further and further into the future through innovations, which essentially reset the initial conditions of the general growth equation that Betancourt et al. Used. But these innovations only prolong the inevitable. So long as the system is still operating through its old way of doing things with a beta greater than 1 scaling superlinearly, you're just going to be headed for another singularity just a little bit later in time. And the time scale between these necessary innovations to avoid crises decreases over time. So basically, you have to innovate at a faster and faster clip. So this is what may be occurring at the scale of cities. Can we extend it to the planetary scale? And I think it might be reasonable to do so. And that reason is the data ohm. So the evolution of life can be thought of as a series of major transitions in information processing, as well as units of selection. And there are many more transitions than what's shown here. But to illustrate this concept, for much of life's history, information was primarily stored and processed in molecular form, in DNA and the genome, et cetera. With the evolution of neural architectures, a shift occurred to neuronal information processing. And today we're entering an age in which much of humanity's information processing is done through the dataome, which was a term coined by astrobiologist Caleb Scharf to denote all of the information that we create external to our biological bodies. So our phones, our computers, the Internet of Things, even our books and our architecture as well. So we may be in an informational major transition at the moment where information processing is happening very distributedly thanks to the technology that we've invented. And this technology enables us to literally sidestep the physical limitations of human social interactions. For instance, I'm on Zoom right now, probably thousands of miles from where most of you are. And remember, it's these social interactions that seem to drive this superlinear scaling. So it could be that the planet need not physically be one global city for planetary civilization to behave like one. So this leads us to our asymptotic burnout hypothesis, which basically says a planetary civilization optimizing for growth and productivity will march towards a singularity, where eventually resources will no longer be able to sustain this trajectory of unbounded growth. Now, not only does it get harder to avoid the singularity because that timescale of innovation gets shorter and shorter and shorter over time, but as you grow in size, as you grow in energy harnessing and informational power, you will also be able to inflict greater degrees of disruptive fluctuations upon yourself. So for instance, climate change is a fluctuation that was brought about when we learned how to use fossil fuels. Nuclear war is a threat that has loomed over us ever since we learned how to unlock the power of the atom. And what Stuart and I call it a disinformation catastrophe, we may be inviting right now through our use of the internet and artificial intelligence. So is there a way out of this? We propose a hypothetical way out, which we call the homeostatic awakening. So prior to burnout, a civilization has the chance to realize the trajectory that it is on and affect some kind of conscious adjustment to it. So on Earth, this awakening required a cognitive horizon that only emerged at the scale of civilization. So we've got kind of a catch-22 here. You need to be a planetary civilization before you have that ability to realize that planetary civilizations head towards burnout. Therefore, the window of opportunity to affect this kind of conscious adjustment to what you're prioritizing may be very, very short compared to evolutionary and geological timescales. In addition, the requirements for rewriting the underlying dynamics of a society in this way are highly unknown because we haven't yet done it. So in the paper, Stuart and I outlined several reasons for optimism. Here's one of them. Previous evolutionary adaptations show that homeostasis can be achieved when new levels of organization emerge. For instance, there's quorum sensing, where microbes are able to detect the cell density in the group around them and actually change their gene expression accordingly to adapt to these new circumstances. Multicellularity is, of course, a classic example of how homeostasis can emerge at new levels of organization. And recent research into the normalization of cancerous cells through bioelectrical signaling also is very promising. So we wonder, is self-awareness driven reprioritization towards planetary homeostasis just the next transition that life takes or must take after civilization as we know it? Everything that I've been talking about can be summarized in graphical form. So basically, we wonder whether type 3 civilizations are essentially shielded from the trajectories of most real civilizations in the universe by what we call a burnout horizon. So after the origin of the dataome and any biosphere in the cosmos, civilizations will either go along a collapse trajectory or learn how to transition into homeostatic reorientation and explore other expansion in other dimensions other than sheer population size. So we think that this suggestion offers a new solution to the Fermi paradox, because other solutions to the Fermi paradox basically involve bottlenecks that are just probability based. Someone just set a very low parameter to any one of the Drake equation parameters. Maybe it's really difficult for the emergence of life to take place in planetary environments, or maybe it's difficult to evolve complex life, or really difficult for intelligence to come about, or really difficult for civilizations to emerge. On the other hand, our proposal is that there may be an inevitable barrier emergent from the dynamics of energy and information flows within any living system that civilizations will either meet and faceplant into or learn to redirect themselves around. Now, one of the implications of this burnout awakening hypothesis, should it be borne out, is this: the expected lifetime of planetary civilizations. This L parameter may be bimodal, where you have a cluster of civilizations that basically collapse due to burnout, a cluster of civilizations that have achieved homeostatic reorientation and therefore can live for much longer, and virtually nothing in between. Now, the famous SETI astronomer Jill Tarter suggested to us this, that maybe to get from one hump to the other, the trigger might be the discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence, sort of rewiring the psyche of that civilization. But I think there might be a slight catch to this, in that those civilizations that are about to collapse due to burnout could be the easiest to detect. They are dissipating energy at a wild pace, basically a flare in the sky with a high signal to noise, whereas those that have achieved homeostatic reorientation may be much more difficult to detect. They may be indistinguishable from nature. So I'll just leave my conclusions up here, and just want to reiterate before we close that everything that I've said today is just a hypothesis, just another idea to add to the table, to ponder and to provoke some introspection on our own part, because we are life in space. And astrobiology it's very unique field, because not only are we the experimenters, but we're also the experiment. And you should feel free to disagree with any of our assumptions or our conclusions here. But what I really want to leave you with is this: the idea that life has gone through so many major transitions in evolution over the past 4 billion years, and there's no reason to believe that we're stopping major transitions, right? That we're done with them. Civilization as we know it may not be the pinnacle of biological organization, just as biofilms and ant colonies were not the pinnacle of biological organization. And so we ought to consider the idea that we can't just expect planetary civilizations to spread across the galaxy in a colonialistic manner just because that's what our ancestors did here on Earth. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions. I believe Stuart is also on the line too, so we can team answer questions if he's up for that.
Thank you very much, Michael. Also, you were perfect in time, and there are very positive comments here in the chat. Great story, wonderful talk. So there is question for a question, please. Or comment. It's very, thought inspiring. This talk.
Hey, Michael, this is Rob Dunn. I'll be talking in a minute. I wondered if you have thoughts about, I mean, are there ways that we can learn from other societies on Earth rather than interplanetary societies that would reawaken a new kind of homeostasis? I mean, looking to ants, looking to some of these quorum sensing microbes, do they offer that same possibility that Jill was talking about?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I think there is so much to learn from the natural world and from other societies that have formed, looking at their dynamics and how they basically do what they do and how they've survived and proliferated and thrived on planet Earth for much longer than we have. And also even looking at other human societies too. I think that a lot of this we still have a lot to learn from essentially the non-Western worlds, looking at how indigenous cultures persisted on their land and still tell stories of natural disasters that occurred tens of thousands of years ago, and remember that in their oral traditions. There's just so much to learn. None of that is my expertise as a planetary scientist. So I'll open it up for discussion, but I think that's an excellent suggestion, Rob.
Perfect.
Thanks,
Okay.
thanks, Michael, and thanks for the great talk.
Thank you, Rob, for the question. Now, the session is terminated. Now, I would like to thank again all the speakers, and I leave the word maybe to Silvia, right?
Yes, thank you, Pasquale. Yeah, we will have a short break of 10 minutes and then we will come back because Rob Dunn is already here with us and he will give us his amazing keynote talk of today. So see you soon in 10 minutes.